Hi, I am Mrs. Sloan, and this is a video for my honors biology students. This, for us, is chapter 20, and it's on the endocrine system. We're going to break this content up into two videos. So this first video, I'm going to give you an overview of the endocrine system, compare and contrast positive and negative feedback, and compare and contrast the endocrine system with the nervous system, and talk to you about the hypothalamus-pituitary connection. And then we'll hit all the other glands and pheromones in video 2. So if you are new to my videos, if you go down in the descriptor, for this video here on YouTube, you will see a link to what my students use for their notes. It's 2 columns. Column 1 is the scaffolding. I'll help you fill it in. And column 2, I encourage my students to put in pictures that help them with the reviewing. All right. And it also has a link to this presentation. So here we go. So introduction to endocrine glands and hormones. And I am going to get a pointer here real quick. Maybe, baby. There we go. All right. So on your endocrine system, I want you to take a look, because it's not just, what we think of as the standard glands like the hypothalamus and the pituitary and the pancreas, but your stomach is also part of your endocrine system. It secretes hormones as well. So there are some less obvious ones, but the whole point of your endocrine system, the purpose of it, is to coordinate the activities of the body along with the nervous system. Both the nervous system and the endocrine system work to maintain homeostasis. So on your purpose, coordinates the activities of the body along with the nervous system. So it does that using hormones, and hormones are chemical signals. Now, the hormones are carried in your blood. Remember, we talked about the formed elements versus, there's a lot of activity here at my house, the formed elements versus the plasma. And remember, your plasma contains, it's mostly water, and it contains gases and nutrients and proteins and salts and nitrogenous waste and vitamins and hormones. Here we go. So these are the hormones, and they're going to get pushed out with that hydrostatic pressure at the arterial end of the capillary bed. And the hormones are going to get pushed out everywhere in your body. Everywhere those hormones will get pushed out. But there's only certain cells in your body who have what? Receptors for those hormones in order to make that cell do something, right? So on hormones defined, these are chemicals that affect the behavior of other glands and tissues. Chemicals that affect the behavior of other glands and tissues. And you have that on your notes already about how hormones influence the metabolism of cells, growth and development of body parts, and homeostasis. So endocrine glands, as opposed to exocrine glands. So endocrine glands secrete these hormones into the blood supply. That's why it's called endocrine. Whereas an exocrine gland is like a sweat gland. It will secrete its products into ducts, like I said, a sweat gland, or let's say your gallbladder. Your liver makes bile and it's stored in your gallbladder, and then it will secrete it to the beginnings of your small intestines, your duodenum, your duodenum, right? So anything that secretes it into a duct, and it's usually going to go into your digestive tube or out of your skin, or like salivary glands, right? That would be considered an exocrine gland, but an endocrine gland is putting that chemical directly into your blood. So they secrete hormones into the bloodstream via tissue fluid, not ducts. And I don't mean quack, quack ducts. I mean like ducts, tubes. All right. Okay, so now let's talk about hormones and homeostasis. So both your nervous system and your endocrine system work together to maintain homeostasis. Now, which one do you think is faster, nervous or endocrine? I hope you're saying nervous system is a lot faster using those neurons. And in my class, have just learned about the nervous system, right? And it works very, very rapidly. Hormones are a little bit slower, but their effects are more long lasting. So typically what you have is you have an endocrine cell who's going to put that hormone into the blood supply, and then you will have some, at a distance within your body, you will have some sort of target cell that receives that hormone. Now, what is on this one, on your second one here, all the way over here, actually jump over all the way to the right. Here you're seeing two neurons. You recognize this, right? Here's the cell body. This would be the long axon. These are the synaptic vesicles. They too are releasing a chemical right across that synapse. So it is still using a chemical, but the neurons themselves, how that message travels via an action potential is more rapid, right? And then in between the endocrine system and the neurons of your nervous system, you have these things called neurosecretory cells. They act somewhat like a neuron, and they act somewhat like an endocrine gland. And so they will secrete this neurosecretory cell, carry it into the blood for that target cell. And we're going to see that specifically when we study the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So both of them regulate, but the nervous system here, I've got a chart for you. If you compare and contrast, the nervous system is using neurons, whereas the endocrine system is glands, right? And so you have a nerve impulse, an action potential along that neuron, and then a neurotransmitter where your endocrine system has hormones. You have axons and synapses versus your bloodstream. Your target, remember the nervous system, the effectors are either a muscle or a gland, whereas your endocrine system is throughout your entire body. The nervous system is very rapid, short-lived. Endocrine is slow and long-lasting. They both are controlled by negative feedback, and I'll be talking to you about that in just a minute. So on your notes on hormones and homeostasis, compared to the nervous system, it acts more slowly, but the effect is long-lasting. And the rest, you will cover these comparisons in either your nervous system notes or endocrine system. All right. So let's start talking about feedback mechanisms. So positive and negative feedback. So I think we're used to in just regular vernacular, when you hear the word positive feedback, that's like somebody telling you, you did a really good job when you did this, and negative feedback, that was bad. Don't think about it in terms of communication like that. Okay. Don't think of it as good and bad. Positive feedback is always saying more, 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 and negative feedback is always correcting, saying less to that stimulus. So for positive feedback, and there are fewer examples of positive feedback. Most of our homeostasis is regulated by negative feedback, but positive feedback is whatever stimulus is given, that feedback is going to create even more stimulus, which then creates even more stimulus, etc. So it's upping. Whereas negative feedback, that stimulus is corrective. That's why when we do homeostasis like this, I'm hovering around some sort of set point. So it will decrease that stimulus. Let me show you a graph to explain that. So positive feedback, let's say you've had, we talked about clotting and platelets, right? And we talked about clotting factors. So when you have damaged cells, those cells send out a signal to form a clot, which then triggers other cells to amplify it. And that clot size then grows and increases until you don't have any more loss of blood in that area. So it's going to some climactic event, which is that blood clot. Whereas when you think of negative feedback and regulation, you have this set point, like your optimal body temperature. If you're too hot, you will sweat. If you're too cold, you will shiver. And it's a regulation between that helps you maintain that body temperature. So for your notes on negative feedback, I want you to have more gets you less. More gets you less. So the hotter it is, the more you'll sweat, and your temperature will drop down, so you will sweat less, right? So more gets you less. The level of the hormone itself or some chemical induced by the hormone will inhibit, that's the word you're looking for, inhibit the further secretion of the hormone. And where it says TH and TSH, I'll talk to you about that when I teach you the thyroid gland. So it's just put a pin in that for now. All right. And then an example of positive feedback, I'm so sorry, I jumped over that. So for positive feedback, more gets you more. And so That's what you need to put in your notes. More gets you more. And an ever greater change in the same direction occurs. So it keeps going up, 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 and up. Ever greater change in the same direction occurs until a cutoff point is reached. And an example of that, a really good one of that, is childbirth. So for instance, when a baby, if it's in the right position there and their head is pushing up against the cervix, okay, when the head pushes against the cervix like that, that sends a message to your brain. And there in your brain, your pituitary gland will start to secrete oxytocin. What does oxytocin do? Well, it causes, there's receptors in your uterus, and it causes the uterine muscles to contract. And when that happens, it pushes the baby again up against the cervix. So now it goes back, and even more oxytocin is secreted by the pituitary gland. So you have even greater contractions of the uterus. And this is going to continue until you have that climactic event like the baby is being born. So that's an example of positive feedback. Okay. Negative feedback is corrective. So for instance, like I said, if your body temperature is above 99 degrees Fahrenheit, you have receptors, thermoreceptors that detect that, sends it to your brain, and then it's going to send commands to the effectors to make your blood vessels dilate, your sweat glands to secrete in order to cool your body back down. So it's corrective. So negative feedback, you're returning it to the right temperature. A really easy example to think of negative feedback is like, I like to make cookies. I set the temperature at 375. Well, at first my oven is not 375, so the heat comes on, right? And then in the oven, once the thermoreceptors receive that we're at 375, the heating elements stop. And then when I open up the oven door to put the cookies in, I'm letting out a bunch of heat. So then the temperature turns back on again, right? So that is self-corrective to the right temperature. Okay. Now, this is an example of video you can watch right here. There's a link to it in the presentation. It's just a little TikTok I did on homeostasis, and we'll watch that in class. Okay, so a quick review on homeostasis. Because we watch homeostasis, you have two systems that contribute to it the most, the nervous system and the endocrine system. Which one do you think is faster? Nervous system, yeah. Endocrine system can be fast with like fight or flight, but all organs help contribute to that. Second, I want to remind you about feedback. When you have negative feedback, that's when you're trying to stay the course. For instance, if your glucose levels go up, insulin will lower it. If your glucose levels go down too far, glucagon will help raise it. So you're trying to maintain that glucose level. Whereas positive feedback, if you're going to have a baby later, not now, if you are going to have a baby, what happens is you will start to secrete oxytocin. Oxytocin will help contract your uterus, which pushes the baby's head against the cervix, which makes it secrete even more oxytocin until the baby comes out. Yay! Yay! Okay, so then the other thing you have is you have what are called contrary hormones or antagonistic hormones to help you keep the right level, let's say, of blood sugar in your body. So if you have high blood glucose, okay, like you've had a big meal, your pancreas will start secreting insulin. And what insulin will do is it's going to lower the blood sugar. So the fat cells will take in glucose and store it as more fat. And that way your blood sugar level is right. However, if you haven't had a meal in a while and you have low blood glucose, then your pancreas will secrete glucagon. And what glucagon will do is it'll ask your liver to convert some glycogen into glucose to raise your blood glucose levels. So those are antagonistic hormones. So on your notes where it says antagonistic hormones, they are contrary and hormones that have opposite effects. And your example is insulin and glucagon. Now, things can go wrong, right? So if you secrete too much of a hormone, that would be called hypersecretion. If you secrete too little of a hormone, that is hypo. So you just need to put hypersecretion too much and hyposecretion is too little. All right, now we have different categories of hormones. So Two big names for them would be lipid-soluble or steroid hormones, and then water-soluble hormones are usually protein hormones. They work differently. What protein hormones will do is they cannot cross the phospholipid bilayer, right? You remember the barrier. And so as a result, what they do is they bind to a receptor. This receptor will trigger a signal transduction pathway, which is like this triggers this, which then ultimately can have a couple of responses. It could have a cytoplasmic response, like increasing the amount of glucose in that cell, or maybe it will affect gene regulation. But this right here, okay, this is what's called the first messenger. And then you can have a second messenger inside the cell, or maybe it allows calcium to come inside the cell and that acts as a second messenger. But the hormone itself never comes inside, okay? Contrary to that is a steroid hormone. That is a lipid, and remember this is a phospholipid bilayer, so lipids dissolve into lipids. So this lipid-soluble hormone can cross the phospholipid bilayer, and it has a receptor, but that receptor is internal to the cell. And then generally speaking, what it's going to affect directly is gene regulation. This receptor, you might be activating a transcription factor to help RNA polymerase bind to the promoter, okay? But this hormone comes in the cell, even in the nucleus, in order to have its effect. So an example of a second messenger would be here. Epinephrine, another name for that is adrenaline, will bind to a receptor, and then this starts a whole signal transduction pathway, which eventually you have a second messenger called cyclic AMP. So for your notes on peptide hormones, water soluble and second messengers. So you have the notes there. The hormone binds to the receptor in the plasma membrane. The binding triggers a second messenger, which triggers a metabolic cascade of events or could affect gene expression. Whereas with a steroid hormone, because it is a phospholipid, when it leaves the capillary, it can go right through the phospholipid bilayer. It can bind to a receptor internally, and then it can enter the nucleus and influence gene transcription and ultimately a protein getting made. This going all the way in and then having to trigger transcription and translation, that's going to take a little bit longer. And that's why your steroid hormones have these long-term effects. What are some examples of steroid hormones? Progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, all your sex hormones, and then the hormones of the adrenal cortex. Your adrenal gland sits on top of your kidneys. It has a cortex and then an interior part called the medulla. And the adrenal cortex has glucocorticoids, cortical sex hormones. Those are also steroid hormones, but the bulk of your hormones are the first ones, the protein hormones that trigger the second messenger. So for steroid hormones, you have that it's lipid soluble, it affects gene expression, it enters the cell membrane, it binds to a receptor, and letter B on your notes, the hormone receptor complex activates a gene, and ultimately a protein is formed. All right, so now we have the basics, and this part 2 is going to go into the glands and the hormones. And in this particular video, I'm just going to talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and in the second video, I'll talk about more. All right, and why am I talking about the hypothalamus and the pituitary? Well, the hypothalamus is in your brain, okay? So here's a bunch of glands and hormones, but your hypothalamus is in your brain. It is full nervous tissue. We've studied that in the nervous system, right? But what it controls is the pituitary gland that hangs down below it. Here is your pituitary gland hanging right here, okay? And there are two parts to your pituitary gland, but either way, it is called the master gland. And it's called the master gland because it controls so many things in your body. Now, here in your nervous system, the hypothalamus, remember I talked to you about kind of those in-betweener cells, these neurosecretory cells that actually make hormones? Well, neurosecretory cells make the hormones for the posterior pituitary. And these neurosecretory cells extend from the hypothalamus, okay, all the way down into the posterior pituitary and secrete the hormones of the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary stores those hormones until triggered by other neurons to release them. So the hypothalamus's neurosecretory cells are actually making the hormones of the posterior pituitary, and it extends down into it. Now, during the development, when you were an embryo, your posterior pituitary literally descended down, just like testes can descend down out of the abdominal cavity. Your posterior pituitary descends down from your hypothalamus during development. Your anterior pituitary, this other section did not. Your anterior pituitary actually grew up out of the roof of your mouth and then grabbed onto the stalk right here. So this is controlled differently. And the reason is it did not actually come from the hypothalamus. It grew up and grabbed onto the stalk. So this is one of 3 places in your body where you have a double set of capillaries. Here, the first set of capillaries is going to be here in the stalk. The hypothalamus can reach as far as the stalk, and it puts in their releasing hormones, which are then carried by the blood immediately without returning to the heart and going to the lungs and the heart and back out again. It immediately branches into a second set of capillaries here in the anterior pituitary. These releasing hormones that were originated from the hypothalamus then come out of the capillaries and hit the anterior pituitary cells. That tells the anterior pituitary to put in stimulating hormones into the blood, which then leaves from a venule and then to a vein, heart, lungs, heart, and to the rest of your body. So it doesn't have as direct control as it does of the posterior pituitary. It's a little more indirect, but done very well with the double set of capillaries. Now, you remember where we saw the double set of capillaries before when I talked to you about the connection between the blood that leaves your small intestines and your stomach. It is immediately shunted via the hepatic portal vein to your liver, and there your liver, if you have excess nutrients, will store it, or if you don't have enough nutrients, it will add to it. Here is the second one, and then the third one is in your kidneys, where you have these double capillaries, but it is very unusual. Okay, so on your notes, underneath 20.2, hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus helps regulate the internal environment through the autonomic nervous system. We've learned about that, right? Somatic autonomic stuff you don't have to think about. And the glandular secretions of the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is identified as the master gland. The master gland because it controls so many other glandular secretions. And the pituitary has 2 portions, and each is controlled differently by the hypothalamus. So taking a look at this picture right here, let's start with the posterior pituitary, and that's on your notes. So here's the hypothalamus. It has these neurosecretory cells that will extend directly into the posterior pituitary because it came from there, and it has other neurons that will stimulate the release of these 2 hormones, these 2 categories of hormones, oxytocin and ADH. And we already learned about oxytocin, right? And birth. But for your notes on posterior pituitary, you want to have under control, it's directly by the hypothalamus, who has neurosecretory cells extending into the posterior pituitary. And then that posterior pituitary, which stores, that's the word you need, which stores the hormones until release. All right, now the 2 hormones, oxytocin and ADH. Oxytocin, like I told you before, is going to have your uterus contract in order to push out a baby. But there's something else that oxytocin does. Not only does it make a baby come out, but it has milk come out of the mammary glands. And why would that be important? If the baby's out, it's going to need to be fed. So oxytocin is the hormone that stimulates breast milk to leave the breast tissue. Now, I want to jump over here to the anterior pituitary real quick, because the anterior pituitary secretes something called prolactin. It's this one right here. Prolactin is the hormone that makes the milk, that gets the milk to be made in the mammary glands, but it's oxytocin that gets the milk released. Okay, so on your notes for oxytocin, it's uterine contractions, baby out, and milk release, which is milk out. So I think of oxytocin as the out hormone. Okay, ADH controls your kidneys. What ADH stands for is anti-diuretic hormone. And what antidiuretic hormone does is it causes your kidneys to keep more water and not to urinate it out. And the way I remember that is if you urinate out too much water, if you lose too much water through your urine, you will die. So this is antidiuretic hormone. It causes water to be reabsorbed so that you don't urinate it. So ADH controls the kidneys, causing water reabsorption so you pee less. Okay. Now, so you pee less. So think about it. There are some things that are diuretics. Alcohol is a diuretic. So when people drink a lot of alcohol and they're not also drinking water, they urinate a lot and they lose that water. And that's why it caused them to have a hangover, because they have lost so much water due to the alcohol. Caffeine is a diuretic. It makes you pee more. Okay. This is an antidiuretic. Now, let's talk about your anterior pituitary. Your anterior pituitary is controlled indirectly, right? Because there are neurons, neurosecretory cells that reach only as far as the stalk, in the capillaries in the stalk, and they put in releasing hormones. You can see it right here, releasing hormones, which are carried by the blood to the second set of capillaries immediately following in the anterior pituitary. These releasing hormones cause then the anterior pituitary to secrete stimulating hormones that control all of these things right here, which if you look at all of these pictures, it's a lot, hence the reason why the pituitary gland is called the master gland. So underneath control, indirectly through two sets of capillaries, indirectly through two sets of capillaries, the first extending into the stalk and it puts its releasing hormones in. The second set is in the anterior pituitary directly, where the releasing hormones from the hypothalamus trigger stimulating hormones from the anterior pituitary. So it's releasing hormones and then stimulating hormones. And you could think R comes before S if that's helpful. All right, so let's talk about some of these stimulating hormones. The first one on your notes is TSH, and that stands for thyroid stimulating hormones. So when the anterior pituitary secretes TSH and it goes into the blood, back to the heart, to the lungs, to the blood, and then out to the body, it is your thyroid gland that has receptors for thyroid stimulating hormone, which then makes the thyroid gland secrete thyroid hormones. Now, what I want you to see right here is when the thyroid hormone level increases, then it goes dun, 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 negative feedback onto both the hypothalamus and to the pituitary gland, telling it to stop. Just like my oven, when it hits 375, doesn't need the heating on anymore. So when the thyroid hormone levels are high enough, then that exerts negative feedback on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. All right, next. ACTH stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone, and this stimulates the adrenal cortex, which is the outside of your adrenal gland. It sits on top of your kidneys. The adrenal medulla is stimulated differently, and that secretes adrenaline and noradrenaline, like fight or flight, okay? But your adrenal cortex is going to secrete other hormones. So on your notes for right now, ACTH stimulates the adrenal gland, and it too, when the levels are higher enough, will exert negative feedback. Prolactin, we already learned about. Prolactin will stimulate milk production. So you actually have milk in your mammary glands, stimulate milk production in your mammary glands. And then growth hormone, let's see where that is. Growth hormone is good. The target is your bones and your muscles. So growth hormone to stimulate bones and muscles to grow. And then FSH and LH. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. LH stands for luteinizing hormones. And both of these hormones are what's called gonadotropins. And for gonads, they either are going to stimulate ovaries if you've got those, or stimulate testes. So testes would secrete testosterone then, and ovaries would secrete estrogen and progesterone. And just like these other ones, they will exert negative feedback on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So I want to hit a few disorders that you could have. Now, you know about diabetes where you don't secrete enough insulin. You can have type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and I'll be talking about that in video 2. But this is called diabetes insipidus. This is a little bit different. So normally, right, the pituitary gland secretes ADH and tells the kidneys, hold back on some of that water, reabsorb it, don't urinate it. But in diabetes insipidus, the pituitary gland doesn't make enough ADH, not enough antidiuretic hormone. So as a result of that, your urine is full of water, right? And that can cause problems with dehydration. The way I always remember that is you better sip some water. Diabetes insipidus, you better sip some water because you're losing too much of it. So on your notes, diabetes insipidus is too little ADH is secreted, not enough water is reabsorbed. Okay? Gigantism versus dwarfism. So clearly with gigantism, you have too much growth hormone. This is a full-grown man. There are many different types of dwarfs. This particular dwarf, all the body is in the right proportions. So for pituitary dwarfism, there's too little growth hormone. And for gigantism, there is too much growth hormone early on. Now, there's some other ones I have in small print, okay? I'm not going to hold you accountable for that, but I just wanted to kind of share with you about them. Acromegaly is when you're done growing, like I'm old, I'm not going to grow any taller. Only thing I can do is get wider with fat cells, but I can't grow any taller. But this is when you get done with growing, but you keep secreting growth hormones. So only those tissues that can grow will continue to grow because a lot of your growth plates are done. So sometimes, bones of the face and the hands continue to grow. So that's acromegaly, overproduction of growth hormone as an adult. And then this is another one called Cushing Syndrome. And this is where you are over-secreting your adrenal cortex. And in this case, it was due to a tumor, but there are other ways you can have Cushing syndrome as well. And so once this was before the tumor was removed, and this was after. So it's too little adrenocorticotropic hormone. And as a result of that, there's too much cortisol is secreted, and you end up having too much fat. All right. So those are some things that can go wrong. So video 2, this is the end for this video, but video 2, we will talk about all of these other glands and what how they regulate your body. And if you're one of my students, I'll see you in class.